In the soft glow of a street light on a cold autumn night, Officer Raymond Tanner was nearing the end of his shift. He had spent the last several hours patrolling the quieter neighborhoods, looking forward to going home to his family, maybe sharing a quick laugh with his wife about the latest antics of their toddler. But tonight, something was off. He could feel it. A tugging sense of unease as he drove through the dimly lit streets. The quiet was suddenly broken by a call on the radio. A concerned neighbor had reported seeing something strange near an abandoned house on Oak Street. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but Raymond detected a hint of urgency. He felt his pulse quicken as he turned the wheel, heading toward the location. Oak Street was not an area known for trouble, but that only heightened his curiosity. What could possibly be happening there at this hour? As he pulled up, his headlights swept across the overgrown yard and the sagging roof of the old house. At first, it seemed empty, just another forgotten structure. But then, in the glow of his headlights, he saw them. Huddled near the edge of the driveway was a young boy, no older than 10, with two tiny figures bundled close to his chest. The boy's clothes were thin and worn, ill-suited for the chilly night, but he was cradling the two babies with a fierceness that told Raymond this was no ordinary scene. Raymond's heart ached at the sight, but years on the job had trained him to keep a calm demeanor. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy, who had already fixed him with a wary, tired gaze. As Raymond got closer, he could see the babies more clearly, two tiny, wide-eyed infants, their dark eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. Despite their shivering bodies, they seemed strangely at peace in the boy's arms, as if they somehow knew he was their protector. "Hey there, buddy," Raymond said softly, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "Are you all right?" The boy didn't respond immediately. He just looked at Raymond with an intensity that went beyond his years, clutching the babies even tighter. Raymond noticed the boy's knuckles were white from gripping them so firmly, and his eyes were rimmed with red, as though he hadn't slept in days. "My name's Raymond. I'm a police officer. I'm here to help, okay?" He continued, trying to reassure him. "What's your name?" The boy glanced down at the babies in his arms before finally meeting Raymond's gaze. "My name's No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Raymond nodded, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "No, that's a good name. And who are these little ones with you?" No hesitated, then glanced down at the babies with a look of pure, unguarded love. They're my family," he said softly. His voice wavered, but the determination in his eyes didn't falter. "I have to keep them safe." Raymond felt a lump in his throat. This was no ordinary story, and he could tell that No's life had been anything but ordinary too. What had led him to this moment? How had he come to be out here alone in the cold with two babies in his arms? Questions raced through Raymond's mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing on keeping No calm. "All right, No," Raymond said, his tone soft but steady. "We're going to get you and these babies somewhere warm, okay? You all look like you could use some food and a place to rest." At the mention of leaving, No tightened his grip on the babies, a flash of fear crossing his face. "No, I can't go. They're not safe." His voice trembled, and Raymond could hear the weight of a story he had untold in those few words. "Who isn't safe, No?" Raymond asked gently, feeling a sense of urgency rising. He couldn't shake the feeling that this boy had been through more than most adults could bear, and the thought made his heart ache. He wondered what kind of hardship, what kind of fear would drive a boy so young to shield two infants in the dead of night. No's eyes darted around, his expression caught between exhaustion and anxiety. He seemed to be weighing whether or not he could trust Raymond. After a long pause, he finally whispered, I don't know who they are, but I know they're looking for us, and I can't let them take the babies. They'll hurt them. They'll hurt all of us." Raymond felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had expected many things when he stepped out of his car that night, but this was not one of them. He looked at Noah, seeing not just a frightened boy, but a fierce protector who was willing to stand up against unimaginable odds for the two tiny lives he held close. This was a child who had somehow taken on a burden that would be too much for most adults. Raymond took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "No, listen to me," he said, meeting the boy's gaze with a firm but compassionate look. "I don't know what you've been through, but I promise you this, you're not alone now. No one is going to hurt you or these babies while I'm here. I'll make sure of that." Noah's eyes softened, and for a moment the walls he'd built around himself seemed to waver. He took a shaky breath and nodded, but the fear was still there, lingering in his gaze. There was something more he wasn't telling, a reason why he had run so far, why he was out here in the cold, alone but fiercely determined to protect these babies. Just as Raymond was about to speak again, a faint noise caught his attention, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, coming from somewhere in the shadows beyond the streetlight. He turned his head, scanning the darkness, feeling it prickle of unease at the thought of who, or what, might be out there. Without thinking, Raymond shifted his position, subtly placing himself between Noah and the direction of the noise, shielding the boy and the babies from whatever might be lurking in the night. "Stay close to me, Noah," Raymond whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. He kept his eyes trained on the shadows, every sense alert, knowing that whatever was coming might just be the threat Noah had been so afraid of. And as the footsteps grew louder, the boy clutched the babies even tighter, his gaze darting nervously between Raymond and the darkened street. There, standing on the edge of the light, a figure began to emerge from the shadows, unfamiliar, yet somehow unmistakable in its purpose. Whoever this was, they were here for Noah and the babies. Raymond felt his pulse quicken, his heart pounding as he prepared for whatever was about to happen. Raymond's hand instinctively moved to the radio at his shoulder, but he paused, catching the uncertainty in Noah's eyes. The boy's grip on the babies tightened as he glanced between Raymond and the figure in the shadows, fear etched deep into his young face. For a fleeting moment, Raymond wanted to tell Noah to run, to hide somewhere safe. But something told him that Noah had been running for a long time. And whatever he was running from, it wasn't the kind of threat a child could escape on his own. The figure stepped closer, its features still masked in darkness, but Raymond could make out enough to tell it was a man. He was tall and moved with a purpose, his steps slow, calculating. The man stopped just at the edge of the light, close enough for Raymond to see the faint outline of a long coat and the glint of something metallic in his hand. Perhaps a flashlight or something else. There was a stillness about him that felt unnatural, almost predatory, as if he were waiting for them to make a move. Noah's small voice broke the silence, trembling but defiant. You're not taking them," he whispered, his words directed more to the darkness than to Raymond. His protective stance over the babies reminded Raymond of a mother animal guarding her young, vulnerable but fiercely determined. The man in the shadows tilted his head, and for a moment Raymond thought he saw a faint smile, cold and unfeeling, as though Noah's words were nothing more than amusing. "No, you know better than this," the man said, his voice low and measured. "You can't keep running forever." Raymond's protective instincts flared, and he took a step forward, placing himself firmly between Noah and the stranger. "Who are you, and what do you want with him?" Raymond demanded, keeping his voice steady. The man ignored Raymond, his gaze fixed solely on Noah. "We both know what happens if you don't come with me," he continued, his tone laced with an eerie calm. "It's for everyone's good, Noah. Yours, theirs." He nodded toward the babies, his gaze indifferent, as though they were merely objects. Raymond felt anger rise in him, but he kept his composure. He could tell this wasn't just about two lost babies or a frightened boy. Something far darker was at play, something that had driven Noah to risk everything to protect these tiny lives. But what and why? Noah looked down, his shoulders slumping as though weighed down by an invisible burden. It was as if, for a moment, the fight in him had faded. But then he looked back at Raymond, his eyes pleading, and something like hope flickered there, as if he had finally found someone he could trust. "I can't go with him, officer," Noah whispered, his voice barely audible. "They'll take the babies, and they'll hurt them. They'll hurt us all." Raymond felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just fear. It was desperation, the kind of desperation that comes when there's nowhere left to turn. He had seen that look before, in people who had been cornered, people who felt they had no way out. And he knew, in that moment, he couldn't let No go with this man, no matter who he was or what authority he claimed. "You're not going anywhere with him, No," Raymond said, his tone firm. He turned his attention back to the man. "I'm going to need you to step back and let us through. I'm taking these kids somewhere safe." The man's smile faded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded Raymond with a cool detachment. "Officer, I'm afraid you don't understand the situation," he said, his tone smooth, but with an underlying menace. "This is a matter far beyond your jurisdiction. This boy and those infants are coming with me, one way or another." Raymond's jaw tightened. He'd dealt with his share of tough characters, people who used intimidation as a weapon. But there was something different about this man, something that sent a chill down his spine. He could tell that this wasn't a person who would back down easily. Taking a breath, Raymond decided to play it calm, hoping to buy some time. "Then why don't you tell me what's going on?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "If there's a reason for all this, maybe I should know." The man's lips pressed into a thin line, and he seemed to consider Raymond's question for a moment. But then he shook his head, as if deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. "This isn't something you need to concern yourself with, officer. Just hand over the boy and the infants, and there won't be any problems." Raymond's hand inched toward his radio again, his mind racing. He knew he was in a delicate situation. This wasn't the type of call where backup would be quick or simple. And if this man was who he suspected he might be, this wasn't going to end with a casual handover. He couldn't just walk away and leave these kids in his hands, not with the fear in Noah's eyes and the man's unnervingly calm demeanor. "No," sensing Raymond's hesitation, tugged at his sleeve, his face a mix of determination and terror. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "Don't let him take us." Raymond's heart clenched. He had no idea what this boy and these babies had been through, but he knew he couldn't ignore that kind of plea. Not now, not ever. "Look," Raymond said, turning back to the man with a steady gaze. "You're saying a lot without explaining anything. If these children are in any kind of trouble, you'd better believe I'm not just handing them over. If you want to sort this out, you're going to need to come down to the station." The man's expression hardened, and for a second, Raymond thought he saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes, something cold and unyielding. He took a step forward, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with, officer. These children belong to us. And if you get in our way, well, let's just say, there won't be anyone left to tell the tale." Raymond's hand tightened on his radio, his pulse pounding. This was beyond any threat he'd faced before. Whoever this man was, he wasn't bluffing, and Raymond could sense that. But he also knew he couldn't let Noah and the babies be taken by this stranger. "Last chance," Raymond said, his voice firm and unyielding. "Step away. Now." For a moment, there was a tense silence, a battle of wills. The man didn't move, his gaze locked on Raymond's. But then, slowly, a smirk twisted at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd reached some dark conclusion of his own. "Have it your way," he said coldly. And without another word, he turned and melted back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. Raymond released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his heart still pounding. He glanced down at Noah, who was staring at him, relief and exhaustion mingling in his expression. "Thank you," Noah whispered, his voice breaking slightly. Raymond knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on Noah's shoulder. "I meant what I said, Noah. You're not alone anymore. Let's get you and these little ones somewhere safe." But as he guided them back toward his patrol car, Raymond couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whoever that man was, he wasn't done. And Raymond knew, deep down, that he had just stepped into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As he drove through the empty streets, with Noel and the babies safely in the back seat, Raymond glanced in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. He knew he had to protect them at all costs. But he also knew one thing for certain: the shadows hiding that man, and whatever he represented was still out there, waiting.